Welcome back to the live broadcast on KTAL LP FM in Las Cruces, New Mexico, your community radio station. Let me throw in another batch of thanks to the listeners who became members. We had 82 of those kind people last week, and hoping we can see more. You can go to the websites, Radio KTAL, QUETAL.org, or lccommunityradio.org, and you can see the donate button. So I hope you visit us there. This is Science. Let's take a look. I'm your host, Vince Skuchik. I'm here with you Tuesdays, every Tuesday, noon to 1. And we have been talking, well, let me call it the Bacteria Show, because the title I gave it is, Have You Thanked the Bacterium Today? So I mentioned how they make vitamins for us in our guts and basically throughout the world, that like vitamin B12, how they made oxygen available, how they basically evolved to give us mitochondria and chloroplasts in ourselves and plants and so on, to make and use oxygen. And I got on to, they were our ancestors all. And then some of the things that they do naturally, like fixing nitrogen gas in the atmosphere into what's usable for life, what we call reactive nitrogen, and recycling of nitrogen and dead matter and everything. I covered some of the technological uses we make, and I mentioned a modern use that's kind of funky, and that's making spider silk. Genetically engineering the bacteria, who obviously don't make spider silk, to do so. But let me throw in a couple more things before I go into that, and that is bacteria are also naturally active and helping us leach metals from ores that we need for our metals. They're in sewage treatment. They're in sensors now for chemicals that we want to monitor. And a big thing that deserves a segment or a show on its own, the so-called CRISPR-Cas system for editing genes in place. That is, not adding genes from another species to, say, a second species, but changing the genes in situ, in our cells, other cells, to correct genetic defects in particular. But anyway, let's roll on to the spider silk story. Okay. There was a story recently on a website called TechCrunch, and it's about a company called Bolt Threads, B-O-L-T, and the threads part is they want to make textiles out of spider silk. So wearable textiles, not engineering textiles. So why spider silk? It's touted to be stronger than other polymers. They said stronger than Teflon, but they really meant Kevlar, the classic thing for bulletproof vests and so on. And spider silk is also claimed to be stronger than steel. But now let's look at some interesting points. First, strength is only one of many properties of a structural material. And yes, textiles can be considered structures. Stiffness and toughness are equally important, and you can't make them all together. Let me do a quick rundown of what the differences are. So let me grab my notes here. Okay. Strength is how much force per unit area, like you make a rope or a little bar segment to test, how much force do you have to exert to break a material? So with steel, let's see, that it might be a couple 100,000 pascals, which is so many newtons per square meter. I won't go into those. I'm trying to remember what the equivalent is in engineering units of pounds per square inch. A big number. Okay, I'm not going to I can't give you the numbers right now for steel and for spider silk. But then another thing is stiffness. Now, what if something is more easily stretched, but you can stretch it a lot farther? So you might say they could have comparable strength, but the one that's harder to stretch per unit length is the stiffer material. Steel is stiffer than spider silk pretty clearly. Another property is resilience. Like when you stretch something, does it come back to its original form? Spider silk is really not resilient, not nearly as resilient as steel. Some of it is fairly resilient, and some of it is meant to permanently deform, to be sticky and keep what it just caught. So anyway, those are various things to consider. And most of the materials that we're talking about, engineering or textile stuff, may have properties that vary with the environment. Now, for steel, one of the most notable things was that some of the hard steels that were used in making Liberty ships during World War II became very brittle in the cold North Atlantic Ocean, and they sometimes suddenly broke apart under wave stresses. More than scary. Now, spider silk is notorious for having its temperature and humidity dependencies. It can become quite flaccid at high humidities and high temperatures. And going back to resilience, I mentioned that some of the spider silks, and there might be like 26 different types, are very resilient and others are not. So if you say, I'm going to make spider silk, you better say which one. And you probably want to really make a blend of polymers differing in resilience and strength and all that, and stiffness. So I don't know what bolt thread is going to use, but if they're going to be making different spider silks, they'll have different strains of bacteria for each one. I should mention, by the way, that they garnered $123 million in venture capital. And right now it seems like an affectation for the rich who want to say, hey, I've got a $300 spider silk tie. But who knows? Another use that's been touted, not by bolt threads, is using spider silk instead of steel cables on aircraft carriers, for example, to arrest a landing aircraft. So two different ways this could be done. What about the trapping kind of silk called flagelliform, as if the aircraft is a big fly? So Stephen Vogel, a really interesting author, in his very readable book, Cat's Paws and Catapults, said that if you use this non-resilient spider silk, it absorbs all the energy so intensively that all of the silk would melt. So that's not going to work. Another way is to use spider silk or steel in arresting cables. These catch the aircraft's tail hook, and then this arresting cable is tied to balancing cables that are spooled out quickly from drums that have sort of big shock absorbers on them. So there you could use tough, strong silk that doesn't have to absorb the energy itself. And one more thing about spider silk, it isn't stronger than Kevlar. Now, both some of the spider silks, dragline silk, and Kevlar are stronger than steel, and notably better than steel per unit weight. But Kevlar is stronger than silk, spider silks, various ones, by at least a factor of 1.5 or as much as 7. There's nothing better for strength than Kevlar. So let me go back to saying what else we can do here. I mentioned in a previous segment that you can find my earlier show segments linked from, well, my website, science-technology-society.com. And it's also on YouTube. You can look for my channel, Vince, V-I-N-C-E, 5305. And I have recordings of all of these show segments. Let me read a list of some of the things that I will consider doing. I would like to hear your comments and your suggestions for what should be useful to cover. All right. So one of them is oxygen in metabolism, or muscle that helps us use that energy. How about counting calories? What do calories really mean? Because if you take food and combust it in a closed device and say how much heat was liberated, those are calories or joules, kilojoules, but they're not the way that we process food and gather energy. And how do plants acquire and use all of their resources? Or how did science arise? There's an interesting quote by Yuri Harari in a book called Sapiens, and he says that the key word is ignoramus. We use that as an epithet, but it has a meaning we don't know. So when the church controlled knowledge, and same thing happened in Islam, and basically said everything that is important to know is known in the scriptures, the Bible, the Quran, and so on. And it's not just the church. All kinds of institutions over history did this. But when somebody said, we don't know, and we should find out, science just exploded into its current status. Okay, there's also a list of books that might be very interesting to read, and I can go into some of those. I already did a segment about cholesterol and how we really are fatheads. We have a lot of cholesterol in our bodies, and it's absolutely critical. We could talk about artificial intelligence, robotics, and employment. And, well, I could go on and on. I've got about 50 or 60 segments right now that I could talk about. Oops, let me cool these guys. We'll be going off and onto a pre-linked segment in about a minute. But meanwhile, thank you for listening to Science. Let's take a look. You're on KTAL LP FM in Las Cruces, New Mexico. I'm your host, Vince Gucic. I'll be with you again next week. And then I will have, as a guest, Professor Kathy Hanley from biology at NMSU. I hope you'll tune in. And again, thank you for listening.